The secret of my stepfather. For years, I thought my stepfather was just a quiet, distant man. But then I started noticing things: late-night disappearances, secret phone calls, a tension in his eyes he never spoke about. I never imagined what I would uncover. Until one night, I followed him. What I discovered changed everything. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring more captivating and emotional stories like this to you. I never thought much about my stepfather. Leonard had been in my life since I was 14, marrying my mom after my real dad left us. He was the quiet type, polite, distant, always there but never really present. I never had any problems with him, but we weren't close either. He worked long hours as an architect, traveled often for business, and when he was home, he spent most of his time in his office or watching TV in the living room. A man of routine, a man of habits. Or at least, that's what I thought. It started with small things that didn't make sense. I began noticing that some nights he wouldn't come home until late, even when he wasn't on a business trip. At first, I assumed he was just out working late, but one night, at around midnight, I woke up to the sound of the front door closing. It was soft, careful, almost like he was trying not to wake anyone. I got up from my bed and peeked through my window, just in time to see him walking down the driveway toward his car. He wasn't dressed for work. He wasn't carrying his laptop bag or wearing one of his usual suits. Instead, he was in a fitted black t-shirt and jeans, looking different, more casual, more relaxed, more like a man with a purpose. Something about it made my stomach twist. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe he just needed to clear his head, or maybe he was meeting an old friend. But it kept happening. At least twice a week, he would leave the house late at night, always dressed the same way, always looking over his shoulder before getting into his car. One night, out of curiosity, I checked his social media accounts. My mom and I followed him on Instagram, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. Just work pictures, a few family shots, and an occasional post about architecture. Nothing personal, nothing revealing. But then I saw it. A notification popped up on his phone while it was left unattended in the kitchen. I wasn't planning to snoop, but my eyes instinctively caught the message preview on the screen. It wasn't from a work colleague. It wasn't from my mom. It was from a man I didn't recognize. Tonight? Same place? I felt my pulse spike. Who was this guy? Why was he texting my stepfather in the middle of the night, asking if they were meeting again? 100 different thoughts ran through my mind, none of them making sense. Was it innocent? Was it something my mom knew about? Was I imagining things? I could have let it go. I should have let it go, but I didn't. Because the next night, when my stepfather slipped out of the house again, I did something I never thought I'd do. I followed him. I had never done anything like this before. Following someone felt wrong, invasive, like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. But there I was, sitting in my car with the engine off, watching as Leonard pulled out of the driveway, his taillights disappearing into the darkness. My heart pounded as I waited a few seconds before following him. I stayed a few cars behind, careful not to get too close. Where was he going? A late-night work meeting? A bar? Some private gathering? We drove through the quiet streets of our suburban neighborhood, past the usual grocery stores and gas stations. But then, he took a turn onto a road that led downtown. I knew this part of the city, full of bars, lounges, and clubs. It wasn't the kind of place Leonard ever mentioned going to. After about 20 minutes, he pulled into a small parking lot behind an unmarked building. The only source of light was a single neon sign above the door that read, "Private Lounge." I parked a block away, my pulse racing as I stepped out of the car. I had no plan, no idea what I was even hoping to find. Leonard got out of his car, adjusting his shirt, glancing around as if checking if someone had followed him. My breath caught. Did he sense me? I ducked behind a street lamp, waiting. Then, to my surprise, a man stepped out of the shadows near the entrance and greeted him. Tall, well-dressed, confident. I couldn't hear what they said, but they exchanged a few words before the man clapped Leonard on the shoulder, laughing. Then, without hesitation, they stepped inside together. Something about the way they moved, the familiarity, the ease, made my stomach tighten. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. I could turn back now, pretend I never saw anything, let my curiosity fade into the night. Or I could go inside. I made my decision. With a deep breath, I walked toward the entrance. As I approached the entrance, my heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. The neon sign above the door flickered slightly, casting a faint glow over the narrow alleyway. Everything about this place felt discreet, hidden, like it wasn't meant to be found by just anyone. Leonard and the man had already disappeared inside. The door was heavy, and when I pushed it open, I was met with a completely different world. Soft, moody lighting filled the space, accompanied by low music and hushed voices. The air smelled of expensive cologne and something else. Something intimate. I stepped inside cautiously, my fingers curling into my palms. It was a lounge, but not just any lounge. The crowd was almost exclusively men. Well-dressed, some laughing at the bar, others sitting closely together in darkened booths. There was an undeniable energy in the air, a quiet intimacy that told me everything I needed to know. This was a private gay bar, and Leonard was here. I moved carefully through the dimly lit room, my mind spinning. Why would he be here? What was he doing? Then I saw him. Leonard was sitting at a booth near the back, across from the same man who had greeted him outside. They were talking, leaning slightly toward each other, the conversation just a little too private, a little too intimate. And then, it happened. The man reached out, his hand resting lightly on Leonard's wrist. And Leonard, the man who had always been so reserved, so distant, so composed, let it happen. He didn't pull away. He didn't stiffen. He let the touch linger. I felt the air leave my lungs. This wasn't just a meeting. Leonard was hiding something. I stood there frozen, unsure if I should run or stay, if I should confront him or pretend I never saw any of this. But before I could decide, Leonard looked up, and our eyes met. His face immediately changed. Shock, panic, fear. I turned on my heel and bolted for the exit. I pushed through the heavy door and stumbled into the cool night air, my heart slamming against my ribs. My breath came in short, uneven bursts as I hurried down the alleyway, desperate to put as much distance between myself and that place as possible. Leonard had seen me. There was no mistaking the look in his eyes. Pure panic. I had never seen him like that before. He was always so composed, so controlled. But the moment our eyes met, it was like his entire world collapsed in an instant. I reached my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the door handle. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of here. But before I could pull away, I heard footsteps behind me. Fast, urgent. "Wait!" My body tensed. I knew that voice. I gripped the steering wheel, refusing to turn around. "Please, just wait a second." Leonard's voice was closer now, out of breath. I swallowed hard, my pulse pounding in my ears. I didn't want to face him. I didn't even know what to say. But before I could make a decision, he was right outside my car, knocking on the window. I hesitated, then rolled it down, just enough to hear him clearly. Leonard's face was still pale, his normally sharp features slightly unsteady. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling deeply. "Let's talk," he said, his voice strained. I finally met his gaze. "Talk about what?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "The fact that you—" I cut myself off, suddenly unsure if I should even say it. Leonard's jaw tightened, and for the first time in my life, I saw something I never expected to see in him. Fear. Real, genuine fear. "I know what you saw," he admitted, his voice lower now, like he was afraid someone else might hear. "But please, let's not do this out here. Come with me." I scoffed. "Come with you where?" He looked over his shoulder, back toward the bar, then back at me. "Just somewhere we can talk." I hesitated. My whole body screamed at me to say no, to drive off and pretend I never saw anything. But the look in his eyes held me in place. For the first time ever, Leonard wasn't just my distant stepfather. He was a man with secrets, a man who was afraid. And despite everything, I wanted to hear what he had to say. I exhaled sharply and unlocked the door. "Fine, let's talk." Leonard nodded, stepping back as I got out. He gestured toward his car. "Follow me. There's a quiet place a few blocks from here." I nodded, still unsure if I was making a mistake. But either way, it was too late to turn back now. I followed Leonard's car through the quiet streets, my hands gripping the wheels so tightly my knuckles turned white. The city lights flickered past, but I barely noticed them. My mind was racing, looping the moment over and over, the way he had been sitting with that man, the way he hadn't pulled away, the way he had looked at me when he realized I had seen him. I had no idea where we were going, but I didn't stop. I needed answers. I needed to understand. Finally, after about 10 minutes, Leonard's car pulled into an empty parking lot near a small waterfront park. I parked a few spaces away, but I didn't move at first. I just sat there, staring at the steering wheel, trying to process what was happening. A sharp knock on my window snapped me out of it. Leonard stood outside my car, his face tense. I could see the slight rise and fall of his chest, like he had been holding his breath the entire drive here. I exhaled heavily before finally stepping out. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of the nearby river. The world felt too quiet. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, Leonard ran a hand over his face, letting out a tired breath. "I guess there's no point in pretending anymore," he murmured. I crossed my arms, my voice colder than I expected. "Yeah, I think we're past that." Leonard let out a humorless chuckle, then shook his head. "You're right." He gestured toward a nearby bench under a dim streetlight. "Let's sit." I hesitated, but eventually followed him. As we sat, I kept a few inches between us, my arms still crossed, waiting. Leonard stared out at the river, his expression unreadable. Then finally he spoke. "I never meant for you to find out this way," he admitted. His voice was quieter now, like the weight of everything had finally caught up to him. I swallowed. "Find out what exactly?" Leonard closed his eyes for a moment, then looked at me. "That I'm gay." Hearing him say it out loud was surreal, like the words had physically altered the air around us. I stared at him, my pulse still hammering. "You've been married to my mom for almost a decade." His jaw tightened. "I know." "Does she know?" Leonard flinched, like I had hit a nerve. He shook his head. "No, she doesn't." I exhaled sharply, running a hand through my hair. "Jesus, Leonard." Silence stretched between us. Then, finally, he spoke again. "I never planned for my life to be this way," he admitted. "I was raised in a family where being gay wasn't an option. My father—" He stopped, his fingers clenching briefly before relaxing again. "Let's just say I learned early on how to hide, how to be the person everyone expected me to be. I didn't know what to say to that. He let out a soft, bitter laugh. And for a long time, I thought I could do it forever, that I could play the part, have the life I was supposed to have. He shook his head. Then I met your mom, and she was... He sighed. She was safe. She was kind. And I thought maybe I could love her enough to make it all go away. A lump formed in my throat. But it never went away. I murmured. Leonard met my gaze, his eyes filled with years of unspoken truths. No, he said quietly. It never did. For the first time since this night had started, something inside me shifted. I had spent my whole life thinking of Leonard as distant, detached, a man who never quite fit in our family. And now I finally understood why. He had been hiding from himself, from us, from everyone. And suddenly, I didn't feel as angry anymore. I just felt sad. Leonard turned back to the water, his voice barely above a whisper. I never wanted to hurt anyone, especially not you or your mom. I exhaled, staring at the dark river ahead. So what happens now? Leonard swallowed hard. I don't know, he admitted. But I do know one thing. I looked at him. For the first time in my life, I don't want to hide anymore. And just like that, everything changed. The car ride home was tense, the silence thick like a storm about to break. I could feel the weight of everything pressing down on us, the years of secrets, the unspoken truths, the reality that nothing would ever be the same. Leonard kept his hands on the wheel, his grip tight, his jaw clenched. The glow of the streetlights passed over his face, flickering between light and shadow. He looked different now. Not the man I had known all my life. Not the quiet, distant stepfather who had always been just out of reach. He looked like a man on the edge of losing everything. And maybe he was. I stared out the window, my mind spiraling. Did my mom ever suspect anything? Had there been signs she ignored? Or had Leonard been so careful, so calculated that she had truly never seen it coming? I swallowed hard. When are you going to tell her? Leonard inhaled sharply, his knuckles whitening. He didn't answer immediately. I don't know, he admitted finally. His voice was strained, like saying it out loud made it more real. I don't want to hurt her. I turned to him, my chest tightening. You already have. His breath hitched slightly, and for a moment he just stared at the road ahead. He looked like a man who wanted to rewind time, undo the mess he had made. But there was no going back. She deserves the truth, I said, my voice firmer now. Leonard nodded, his throat bobbing. I know. We pulled into the driveway, the house quiet and dark. My mom was asleep. She had no idea that while she rested inside, her entire life was unraveling just a few feet away. Leonard killed the engine but didn't move. He sat there, staring at the house, his breathing slow and uneven. I built this life for her, he whispered. For you. His voice cracked. And now I'm about to destroy it. I clenched my fists. Then why did you do it? His eyes flickered to mine, glassy and exhausted. Because I thought I could change, he admitted. I thought if I loved her enough, if I buried it deep enough, I could be the man she needed me to be. Silence. But no matter how hard I tried, he exhaled shakily, I couldn't stop being me. I looked at him then, not as my stepfather, not as the man who had been lying to my mom for years, but as someone who had been at war with himself for decades. And for the first time that night, my anger wavered. Do you love her? I asked, my voice quieter now. Leonard's face twisted. His lips parted, but the answer took a moment to come. "I love her," he said, "but not in the way she deserves." His voice broke on the last word, and suddenly Leonard wasn't just the liar anymore. He was the trapped one too. I swallowed the lump in my throat, forcing myself to hold on to my frustration. "So what happens now?" Leonard turned away, staring back at the house, the home he had spent years building, the life he had carefully crafted. "I tell her," he whispered. "I tell her. And I let it all fall apart." The confession. The next morning, I woke up to raised voices. My stomach dropped before I was even fully awake. I threw on a hoodie and rushed downstairs. The moment I stepped into the kitchen, I felt the energy in the room like a slap to the face. My mom was standing by the counter, her eyes red and swollen, gripping a mug of coffee like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Leonard stood a few feet away, his hands in his hair, looking wrecked. She had her phone in front of her. My heart stopped. Did she know? Did she find something? Her voice was quiet but shaking. "I got a call from Allison last night." I felt the blood drain from my face. Allison. My mom's best friend. The only other person I had told about what I saw. Oh, God. My mom turned to me, her eyes piercing. "Do you know what she told me?" Leonard's head snapped up at the same time mine did. I swallowed. "Mom, she said my husband has been sneaking around at a gay bar." The silence was suffocating. Leonard's lips parted, his face ghostly pale. She looked at him now, her body rigid, her expression broken. "Tell me it's not true." Leonard didn't answer. His silence was an answer all on its own. Her breath hitched, and for a second, I thought she might faint. I moved to her, but she took a step back, eyes wet with betrayal. "Oh my God," she whispered. Leonard finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "I never wanted you to find out like this." She let out a choked laugh, shaking her head. "So it's true." Leonard inhaled sharply. How long?" Leonard's jaw clenched. She raised her voice. "How long, Leonard?" Silence. Then, barely above a whisper, "Since before I met you." She sucked in a sharp breath, her body shaking. Leonard stepped toward her, desperate, broken. "I never wanted to hurt you. I tried. I tried so hard to be what you needed, but His voice cracked. "I couldn't change who I was." Tears spilled down her face, and I felt something shatter inside me watching it happen. She wiped at her cheek, her hands trembling. "You let me love you. You let me build a life with you. And all this time, you—" She choked on her words, turning away. Leonard's face was pure devastation. "I thought I could love you enough to make it real." Her shoulders stiffened. She turned back, her expression now cold, unreadable. "That's not love," she whispered. Leonard closed his eyes, his entire body crumbling in on itself. I stood there, my own chest tight, watching everything fall apart in front of me. And yet, even in the wreckage, there was something else. Leonard wasn't hiding anymore, and that changed everything.